The Indian Civilization Act had the goal of promoting the civilization of Native American tribes by encouraging education and the adoption of modern Euro American customs. It was enacted by the U.S. Congress in 1819, authorizing funding from many religious societies, such as Christian missionaries, to establish schools aimed at educating specifically Native Americans. Along with the Indian Civilization Act was the General Allotment Act of 1887, which allowed for the federal redistribution of tribal lands, and the Compulsory Attendance Law in 1891 for Native American boarding schools, which enabled federal officers to forcibly remove indigenous children from their homes. A U.S. Army officer named Richard Henry Pratt founded the first U.S. Indian boarding school called Carlisle Industrial School in 1879. After the creation of Carlisle, others followed, and more than 523 boarding schools, government funded and often church run, were in the United States in the 19th and 20th centuries. Other schools include Moqui Indian School, Forest Grove Indian Training School, and Chemawa Indian School.
These children suffered a great deal. In 1887, the Indian Affairs Commissioner John D.C. Atkins banned children from speaking their native languages in boarding schools. Wearing native clothing or hairstyles, as well as practicing cultural traditions, were also banned. Their names would often be replaced with Western style English names, and more often than not, violations of these practices would lead to strict punishments such as physical beatings or isolation. The curriculum at these schools was specifically designed to erase Native American identities and replace them with Euro American norms. Standard academic subjects like reading, writing, math, history, and art were also taught. However, there were also subjects included to teach trade and practical life skills in their schedules. Boys were trained in manual labor skills such as farming, carpentry, and blacksmithing, while girls were taught domestic skills such as sewing, cooking, and housekeeping. They were forced to work long hours in fields, workshops, or kitchens, essentially performing unpaid labor. Indigenous students were also forced to convert to Christianity and celebrate American holidays such as Columbus Day. These students were required to wear uniforms that adhered to Euro American standards of dress, erasing their cultural identity and forcing assimilation. The clothing was often plain, utilitarian, and designed to strip away individuality and cultural expression. Boarding school systems also supported sports and extracurricular activities. For example, football and basketball teams in the boarding schools played a unique and complex role within the assimilationist agenda. While the boarding schools sought to suppress Native identities and culture, sports became a space where these students could excel, find camaraderie, and in some cases, subtly challenge the stereotypes and constraints imposed upon them.
While the federal government felt a duty to take the Indian out of the man, these boarding schools significantly impacted the cultural identities and social structures of Native American communities. The U.S. government had an ethical responsibility to respect the human rights and dignity of Native American peoples, just like their white American citizens. Students were forced to cut their hair and give up their traditional clothing. They had to give up their meaningful native names and take English ones. They were not only taught to speak English, but were punished for speaking their native languages. Their traditional religious practices were forcibly replaced with Christianity and were taught that their culture was inferior. These boarding schools were created to carry out ethnocide against the indigenous people and ruin the foundation of American Indian culture from past generations.
The curriculum from these boarding schools also enforced the beliefs of Christianity upon the natives. This was done to erase their own spiritual beliefs so that the Native Americans could fit the Euro American norms. The Native Americans suffered many kinds of harmful practices. For example, corporal punishment and other forms of physical abuse were commonly used to enforce compliance if they went against any of the rules that were put in place. They often dealt with poor living conditions, dealing with overcrowding, malnutrition, and unsanitary conditions. Children were often required to perform hard labor as part of the curriculum, as well as many survivors have reported acts of sexual abuse by staff members.
During the late 19th century, most U.S. citizens did not see what they were doing was wrong, and Native Americans weren't granted citizenship until 1924, meaning they were not protected by law to preserve their culture. Hollis B. Frissell was an American chaplain and principal at the Hampton Normal and Agricultural School in Virginia. He believed the schools played a major role in solving the Indian problem by making Indian youth unsatisfied with the native culture. Frissell and most citizens who supported the boarding school system believed they would help the Native American children become successful American citizens by abandoning their quote unquote underdeveloped and savage lifestyle.
Even though there were some white Americans who believed the boarding schools were a good idea, others refused to go along with this plan. For example, Catherine Weldon was one of the critics of the U.S. Native American boarding schools. Weldon was an activist with the National Indian Defense Association, an association that advocated for Native Americans' religious freedom and tribal property. Weldon was an example of a non Native individual who took a stand against U.S. policies that sought to dismantle Native American cultures, including the boarding school system through the use of art. Children were taken miles away from home, where they were abused and reprimanded, starved, and banned from doing anything that may constitute as representation of their cultural practices. They were stripped of their traditional clothing, hair, and personal belongings that may have represented their culture. This left many children distraught, with many who also never got to see their families again. According to the Equal Justice Initiative, researchers have confirmed that at least 973, or even more than 2,000 from other sources, Indigenous children died in these boarding schools, operated or supported by the federal government. It is unclear about the cause of deaths, but reports say that some included disease and abuse. Those who did survive still have to struggle with trauma and lasting effects on physical and mental health.
Not only have the establishment of these boarding schools affected the lifestyles of its students, but have also negatively impacted their current generation. Native American boarding schools disrupted the family structures and cultural practices of Indian traditions, and the suppression of native languages and identities have resulted in a loss of cultural knowledge and skills of past generations. Native Americans should have had the right to preserve and practice their spiritual beliefs, languages, and traditions, and it should have been a crucial responsibility for the U.S. government to provide a safe and educational environment for their students.
Native American boarding schools violated tribal sovereignty and Native rights by imposing assimilation policies that disrupted cultural and familial connections. The federal government failed its responsibility to protect Native rights and instead imposed assimilation policies that disregarded constitutional protections like freedom of religion and due process. This led to ongoing advocacy against historical injustices by current Native American generations, with support from other organizations and society.